Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading. Then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis chapter 32. And we're going to talk about some dysfunctional characters. In the midst of all of this dysfunction, there is something that God wants. God wants Jacob. That's really what God is after. And we learn some principles about God through Jacob's story. First, God makes covenants with flawed people. The story of Jacob is a case study of how flawed people create dysfunctional relationships. However, it is interesting that God uses the tensions of these relationships to draw Jacob to himself. God's desire is not only to heal dysfunction, it is to heal dysfunctional people. The second thing we can take away from this is God keeps his covenants. In spite of the fact that God makes covenants with flawed people, Jacob's story reminds us that God keeps his covenants, even when people are flawed and broken. The third thing we can know is God knows how to change dysfunctional people, even in the midst of dysfunction. God uses Jacob's fear and the broken relationship with his brother Esau as an opportunity to turn Jacob into a different man. So, how does God get what he wants from a dysfunctional character? The reason Jacob is returning to his homeland is because God specifically instructed him to do so in verse 13 of chapter 31. Jacob knows when he returns home, he's going to have to face his brother Esau. And since Esau had promised to kill Jacob, there is a great fear in Jacob's heart about meeting his brother. He devises this plan to overwhelm Esau with gifts, and he chooses a group of animals out of his great flocks and sends the groups with shepherds one after another ahead of him. His hope is that as each group meets Esau, the gifts will appease his brother's anger. He intends to follow at the last with his wives and children. The night before, he sent all of his company across the small branch of the Jordan River called Jabbok, and he was left in that place of solitude. During the night, the Lord himself appeared and got into a physical wrestling match with Jacob. Jacob's character is changed when he gets along with God. This becomes a metaphor for rearranging our priorities. More than family, more than wealth, more than sibling hatred, Jacob must make God first in his life. He must get in a place where God is all or nothing. Jacob's character is changed when God wrestles with him. Note that it is not Jacob that first grabbed a hold of God, but rather God wrestled with him. He calls God, because God picked this fight, he can certainly finish it. More than Jacob getting something out of God, God is getting something out of Jacob. God struck Jacob in the hip with a blow that did permanent damage. Jacob never walked the same from that day forward. I think that metaphor is self-explanatory. The first inclination that we have of Jacob's new character is freedom from fear. When he met Esau, he did so from a position of humility, rather than one of warfare. So let's talk about a couple of things, Alyssa. One, we often use this metaphor of wrestling with God when we talk about things that God is changing in our character. What are some things maybe that God has wrestled out of you?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this question because it's not an easy one to answer, and maybe
Publicly.
right publicly
Yeah, maybe in a journal.
in a way that is helpful for other people,
Right.
in a way that doesn't throw other people under the bus. I think one of the things that God has wrestled from me is comfort. There's been times in my life where instead of dealing with bad feelings, however that is, anger, sadness, any of those, that I would just try to ignore them and live in the comfort of just ignoring them and pretending they didn't exist. And that is something that God has changed in me, and it was a wrestling match. I think there was times, and it's not easy to deal with those, especially when your way of dealing with it was to ignore it.
Mhm.
And so I think that is something that is changed. And I mean, you look at the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn, for those are the ones that are comforted. And then you can look at that opposite. Sad are those who refuse to mourn and deal with the inner pain, for they keep God's comfort at arm's length. And churches in America, some churches in America have this gospel where when you become a Christian, you're not going to be dealing with pain or suffering anymore. We put God in a box and put a lid on him and have a sanitized, safe version of Christianity instead of one that will deal with the true realities of life, the true dysfunction that we see in different spaces in our own life, in other people's lives, in our families, all of that, instead of wrestling with God through it and becoming better people through that pain and discomfort that is inevitable.
All of us have things we try to work out of our life. Some of them are clearly sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I guess all dysfunction is the result of sin in general. But I think one of the things we probably do in the church is we make everything a sin issue, and sometimes it is. But sometimes there are other things that create that in us, right? So I was trying to think of an example, and I'm pretty sure I've used something very similar to this on this podcast before, but I will. I'm going to talk about it and how it significantly changed me. So my dad has some pet peeves, right? There are some things like that I knew were lines, like we knew as kids, we just didn't cross that line. One of them was lying, right? We just did not cross that line. But my personality was such that I don't know how to I don't know how to say this appropriately. I'm a fairly gifted talker, right? And I was early involved in sales, so talking to people, persuading people was a big part of what I did. But as a teenager and an early young adult, I struggled with lying. Like I would, if it benefited me, I would tell a lie and not blink twice about it, right? And my dad hated it. Man, he hated it. And sometime before I went, I was called into ministry. So this would have been like between 1992 and 1995. I couldn't put an exact date on it. I probably could. I'd have to go back and see when I bought a particular truck. that was how I'd know. But it would have been sometime in that period of time. And God was really working in my life, and I knew that was something he was trying to work out of me, right? And it became a submission issue for me. Like I had to submit to him and say, okay, I'm willing to do this. And my dad, he would tell you this. I've heard him tell this story a couple of times, not publicly, but in private settings. But he told me, he said, I knew God was dealing with you. He had borrowed my truck to go somewhere. And I had taken this, I've always done some kind of affirmations, we've had debates about that on here. Just reinforcing certain things in my mind. And I was so committed to telling the truth and not lying that in my vehicle, on my planner, I had this, day planner I carried with me that had everything in it. I had this little strip of paper was about that long, and I had it taped to everything. It was on the dashboard of my truck. It was on the mirror of my bathroom. It was beside my bed. I don't think I had a cell phone at the time, and it was I think I said it was on the dashboard of my truck. It was on that planner, but it just said, "I will not lie." And probably for a year, like I kept that up there, to the point that now, but it caused this change. All right, it created another dysfunction for me,
Mm-hmm.
that I was so committed to telling the truth, I didn't really care how bad it hurt you
Mm-hmm.
for me to say it.
That's my problem. Yeah.
Well,
No, just telling the truth when I just need to.
right.
Why did I even add
Yeah,
that in?
I didn't. The truth will just set you free, but everybody don't need to hear it right that
Right.
particular moment, right? And so then it became this this opposite swing of dysfunction, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would just say whatever was on my mind, because I wanted to be so honest, like in it, and it was hurtful. It was painful. It wasn't helpful sometimes, and so then I had to learn how to work and allow God to deal with me back from that dysfunction. I still despise to be lied to. Like right now, if you lie to me, like that's one of I took on that attribute of my dad. Like I didn't understand, why does he act so dang foolish when somebody lies to him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of swung to that side, and because I'm at the place where I would rather you tell me the truth and deal with the pain of it than to be lied to. But so for me, it became the dysfunction of lying, which corrected, I would call overcorrected. It became the dysfunction of speaking the truth unnecessarily, right? Not when I want to ask. They didn't ask me what my opinion was. I just decided I was going to tell them. Why does God begin to heal dysfunctional relationships by starting with healing dysfunctional people?
Because the relationship is only something that exists between two people. And you have to deal with what is in your own heart. You can't change. We talked about this in past days. When you're in a fight in marriage and you're overwhelmed, you can't see the other person be overwhelmed and be like, hey, you're overwhelmed. You have to deal with what you can deal with in a relationship and change how you are acting in that relationship before you can start to repair the relationship with others. So you have to deal with yourself, with any sin, with any hardness, with any bitterness, all of those things we've been talking about this week. And unless you see that in yourself, you're just going to blame the other person and think that the other person needs to change. Where if it's a dysfunctional relationship, there are two dysfunctional people that are dealing, that are unhealthy, that have created.
One may be more than the other.
Right. And it's not to say that every relationship that's unhealthy is not maybe to blame if there's abuse or things like that. I mean, those are relationships that need broken off. But in most dysfunctional relationships where repair needs to be made, both people have played a part at some point. And unless each person individually gets healthy, that relationship will never heal.
And, to an example, the abuse, you talked about abuse. Occasionally I would talk to someone and they keep choosing abusive relationships. And they talk about these dysfunctional people. But they never take a moment to say, what is dysfunctional about me that causes me to keep choosing this same type of character, right?
Right.
And now it doesn't, are they comparable, right? Then that becomes a difficult comparison. I'm physically abusing you to I'm making bad choices in relationships. I keep ending up with an abuser, but it's still dysfunction. And because we view from the outside, one is worse than the other. And I would have to say, yes, that's probably is true. Because we view, it's easy for that other person not to deal with themselves and to always be the martyr and not accept any understanding about why, okay, this is my fifth abusive relationship. Why is it, what inside of me is causing me to choose that? And there are so many other, we could even say that about jobs, right? Why do you keep choosing jobs you hate? right? What about you is making you make these choices? And so I just think if we don't deal with ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't do anything about you.
Right.
I can adjust myself. I can work on myself, but if we ignore if we don't deal with ourselves, no change the other person's making is going to be beneficial.
Right. And when you come in to repair that relationship, if you're in a healthy spot, you're going to be able to deal emotionally better with any response that you get from them if you are in a better place. So
That's right.
work on yourself if you're in a tough relationship, and see how that maybe can change the whole entire relationship and help that, maybe even start to help that other person get healthier.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation in the book of Genesis.